joining, and we are recording today a Q&A session with Dr. Alan Ye, who is Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies at Biola University. And Dr. Ye has spoken at our missions conference a little over a year ago, and then he spoke to our church and school staff about ministering to Generation Z a little bit later. And we're happy that he was with us this morning, recorded virtually on the Sunday morning message. And I took numerous notes today. Well, you can't see that, but numerous notes on the message today, and it's very informative and helpful. So just like previous times, this is the fourth time we've had Q&A with different speakers edifying and educating us on social justice issues, particularly the Bible and ethnicity and race. And so we're going to continue with that today. You can submit questions through the chat, or you can actually unmute yourself, Pastor Alex. Is that how that works? They can unmute themselves, or you will unmute them?
Raise your hand. That'll help me to find them.
Okay,
yeah.
Raise your hand. And
Virtual hand.
Pastor Alex will unmute you and allow you to ask your question live. Well, let me start with a word of prayer, and then we'll collect questions, okay? Father, again, we just thank you for this Lord's Day. We could worship you in spirit and truth. Thank you for the message that we heard today that was biblically informative and challenged and encouraged us. And we just pray that you will bless this time of Q&A with Dr. Ye and give him clarity of mind and leading of your spirit, and give us open hearts. And thank you for this time in Jesus' name, amen. All right, let's see if we got any questions in the chat. Okay. Okay, well, while we're waiting for questions, Dr. Ye, maybe you can just tell us briefly, how's it going at Biola?
Really interesting, because obviously we're dealing with all sorts of different issues all at the same time. One is, of course, the COVID pandemic and the lockdown. Another, of course, is also racial issues and how to deal with things like the Atlanta shootings or all the Black Lives Matter stuff that has happened in the past year. And then, of course, I think everyone is just feeling a general sense of weariness from everything. And my wife and I, in particular, have a 2-year-old toddler. And so we're trying to work from home, be parents, and manage all of that. But the weather is beautiful outside, and I think we have to count our blessings as well. And so I'm hopeful that this year is starting to look up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have one question. How does the concept of a mature church being multi-ethnic fit into the church growth movement, Donald McGavran, of the 70s, where the same culture and language is considered the key to church growth?
Great. I'm so glad you asked this. So Donald McGavran was the founder of Fuller Seminary's School of World Mission, which is now School of Intercultural Studies. They changed the name, but and the whole School of World Mission at Fuller was founded upon this homogeneous unit principle, the HUP. Basically, the HUP says that churches grow fastest when people are with others just like them. Okay. Now, so basically they launched this entire mission school based on homogeneity. Churches grow fastest when people are with others just like them. And people operated on this principle. And here's the thing. I often ask, is fastness the primary quality that you want to cultivate? Is it quantity that you want, or is it quality? And I actually don't think there's really any biblical basis for the speed, right? So Donald McGavran was all about, hey, if you want to grow your churches and grow it fast and grow them big, you know, and I'm like, I'd rather grow slow and grow well than grow fast and balloon and have a bunch of shallow people, right? And so since from the 1970s to the 90s, this church growth movement and homogeneous unit principle was really big. But by the end of the 90s, this really fell out of favor. People were like, I don't really like this. It almost feels like racism in some sense, like separate but equal, right? Because this justify, well, just have your black church over there, just have your Asian church over there, just have your white church over there, and let's not mix, because in service to speed of growth, let's just keep everyone separate, right? And it's like, well, actually, I don't think that's what Jesus wanted. If you look at how Jesus approached the rich young ruler, the rich young ruler came to Jesus and said, I have followed all the 10 commandments since I was a kid. What must else I do? And then Jesus said, you must sell everything, give it to the poor, and follow me. And the guy couldn't do it and had to walk away, and Jesus just let him go. Okay. Now it does say, to be fair, it says Jesus loved him and then let him go. But I think sometimes initially I would have said, Jesus, why did you let the guy go? Right? He was like ripe for the picking. And you just let him go. He actually came to you and said, I want the kingdom. And you made it harder for him, so much so that he walked away. I'm like, exactly. Jesus doesn't want speed or quantity. He wants quality. So he's like, okay, you really want to come in? Then I'm going to up the ante for you. I'm going to make it even harder for you. And those are the types of people that he wants in his kingdom. And so I think when Jesus says narrow is the way, I think this is what he's talking about. He's not just wanting to usher in every halfway Christian. He just wants the all the way committed believers. So anyway, I think the homogeneous unit principle, the church growth movement, and Fuller Seminary School of Intercultural Studies has sort of fallen by the wayside, and is really not operative in the 21st century anymore, even though this was the basis of a lot of missions in the 20th century. And I think it's done a lot of harm, honestly. Yeah, but people still operate on this. There's the legacy of this is that most churches today are homogeneous. Most churches today are monoethnic, and a lot of this is because of McGavran. Do you know where McGavran got this idea from? The caste system in India. He was a missionary in India, went over there and said, oh, well, when the Dalits, the outcasts, get together and they form a church, then the Brahmins, the high caste, don't want anything to do with them. And so he's like, let's just keep all the castes separate. And that way you can grow the church more. And then he brought that concept to the United States and implemented it prescriptively on everyone. I'm like, why are we implementing the Indian caste system on everybody? It just doesn't seem to make any sense. So I think, anyway, I think that's been questioned a lot these days. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, I've got another question here. I'm not sure how to form it. It has to do with the comment, we all benefit from our country successful because of it was built on free labor from the slaves and free land from the Native Americans. But don't we all benefit from the free labor and free land? So maybe, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say absolutely. And so this is why when Asian Americans, when people don't understand history, they jump to false conclusions. So sometimes Asian Americans will do what white people do when looking at Hispanics or Blacks. They'll just say, oh, they're poor and they're criminals, and therefore they're somehow subhuman, right? And they must be lazy and they don't work hard, and that's why they're poor and criminals. Well, we have to look at the whole several hundred years of history and say, maybe there's more to it than just that. Maybe we need to look at the background here. If that's the case, we as Asian Americans can't just waltz into this country and say, well, I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, right? And so why can't Blacks do that? Because we haven't had a whole history of being enslaved. We haven't had a whole history of Jim Crow segregation laws. Now, we've had other things. There was the Japanese internment camps. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were definitely things like that. But the amount that Asian Americans have experienced in terms of discrimination is nowhere near as bad as what Blacks have experienced. Okay, so so I feel like instead of waltzing in self-righteously and saying, well, how come those Blacks can't do what we do? Or we have to realize that part of our success is because we are literally standing on the shoulders of Blacks and Native Americans, right? We are benefiting from the legacy of stolen land and free labor from slavery. And so instead of looking down upon them, I almost feel like we need to have some measure of gratitude for what they've suffered so that we can succeed, right? So I think sometimes I see a lot of racism coming from Asians towards Blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans, and I'm like, I almost feel like we should be more grateful than mean about this, right? Because if we really understood what their community has gone through and how the effects of that are still being felt today, we're reaping the benefits from that in a systemic way.
Thank you. Pastor Alex, could you let Paul out? He's raising his hand. I think he wants a follow-up question on this issue.
Go ahead, Paul.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Pastor Stephen. Thank you, Alan, for coming to speak to us today. Very grateful. It is a very controversial topic, and I really appreciate your time. First of all, I agree with many of the points you touched on today, but I do disagree some. I think it's common because it's a controversial topic. The question Pastor Steve asked, it's actually I asked. So what I want to know from you is, first of all, I am an immigrant. I came to this country 20 years ago, and I don't study history. I cannot say I know the history of America at all. You know, not to say I don't understand my own country's history, but I did make an effort to understand the history. Because, you know, I'm a Christian, I'm passionate about my community. So I do try to understand the background of, you know, what has been happening, especially to our Black, you know, our brothers, the African community. So when you touch on the point that, you know, you know, when we have a question like that, it's not because we don't understand the history. When you talk about the Black, the American African, they were like the slaves, they were discriminated, they had a very tragic, I don't know whether this is the right term, so excuse my terms to describe them and correct me if I use the wrong term. I'm just trying to use my layman to express what I understand. So they were treated very badly. That I understand. But at the same time, that we were talking about those systems, those treatment, those slaves thing were, I don't know, 100 years ago or 150 years ago, the time when the President Lincoln liberated them. I understand it takes time to, you know, resolve all the issues. I believe it takes many years to resolve the problem. But again, it has been more than 100 years. And we have seen so many laws enacted, so many systems try to help these people or the African American. It's a lot of specific ways to help them. And we do see they are kind of, you know, community. They say, or many people still think they are discriminated, or still many people are racist against them. That's come to my question when you talk about the benefits. When we talk about benefits, you say many people easily don't understand their background. But I just want to, the question I ask is, don't we all benefit from the free labor and free land, including the African American or American African? And we are all given the same opportunity. We understand, people are born into two different families. They're raised differently. It's just because they have different culture, different parenting, and we understand all that. But my point is, when you talk about benefits, it seems like we take the benefits away from them, from the systems we are having. That's I don't understand. So can you elaborate on that more? Sorry, I take a lot of time to express what I try to say, but thank you, Alan.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Paul. Those are very honest, sincere questions. There's several parts to this question. Let me just tackle them one at a time. First, I don't think that emancipation solved everything, right? Because what ended up happening was I feel like Blacks went from level 10 oppression, which was slavery, and then they were emancipated, and then they went into level 9 oppression, which was Jim Crow laws, segregation. They were not hired by anyone. So they were free, but they were completely dirt poor because no one would hire them. There's separate schools, separate churches, separate water fountains, separate everything. And then there was redlining and zoning, which means that African-American neighborhoods were devalued and in terms of property values. And so they couldn't build up any equity, and there was discrimination and lynchings. And then they went from that to MLK did the civil rights in the 1960s, and then they went from level 9 to level 8 level of discrimination. So now they got the right to vote, but there was still, still a lot of really awful things. And then, and I think a lot of African Americans feel like, okay, now today they've gone to level 7 discrimination, which is Black Lives Matter, and Blacks are disproportionately incarcerated or shot by police and whatnot. And so instead of saying, oh, they went from a 10 to a 1 when they were emancipated, it was more like they went from a 10 to a 9, and they went from a 9 to an 8, and went to 8 from a 7. So today they're kind of at a 7, right? So it's like, yeah, it's been hundreds of years, but they're like, we're not even close to a 1 yet, right? There's still so many laws that are from a century ago that have not been repealed and still are discriminatory towards African Americans. So there's still a lot more work to do, and yeah, so that's part of the issue. And as far as do they benefit from the free land and free labor, I actually don't think so, because they actually have, like I said, there are systemic laws in place that actually actively work against them. So to use the example of redlining, which I just talked about, right? They actually zoned certain districts for African-American neighborhoods. And what they did is within those zones, property values were devalued, so they couldn't build equity. And also they did that in order so that African-Americans could not elect their own congressman, okay? Because within certain regions, you have to, if they took African-American, they thought, oh, there's enough African Americans here to be able to affect the certain votes, then they would actually divide those up so that they didn't actually have enough votes, and they couldn't actually send people to the Congress. And so those red lines are still in place today, and they have not been overturned. And so they're still disproportionately discriminated against because of laws. And so I think that's what a lot of people don't understand. It's the system is often what works against them, not just individuals. And so and the laws still need to be, and a lot of people don't know what the laws are, or it takes forever to overturn them. And so it's just really hard. So yeah, there still is a lot of lot more work to be done, even though it has been several hundred years. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Paul, did you have a follow-up question with that, or? So there are a couple other questions which I'll get to. I wanted to ask along these lines. So what can individuals do about this, Dr. Ye? What can churches do about this? What can the government do about this?
Yeah. So first of all, as the way our democracy works is that we can write to our representatives, call them, email them, write letters to them, implore them to act on behalf and join movements. Like there's the Asian American Christian Collaborative, or there's a lot of documents that you can sign, like that are on the internet that you can join. And so the force of mobilizing mass movements begins with each individual, right? So collectivism is a trait that Asian Americans share, and we should use our collectivism. And so if you can, I think the Asian American community has long had the stereotype of being silent, always silent and passive. And we get kicked around because of that. I mean, people will say stuff about the Asian American community they would never say about the Black community. And it's not because we're discriminated against worse. It's because the Black community will be vocal if someone's discriminatory towards them. So then people are like afraid to do it anymore. Well, they'll still do it, but they won't at least be so bold in doing it. But to Asian community, because they're like, oh, there was no backlash, so they just keep doing it to us. And they'll say stuff about our community they would never say to any other group. So, and so I feel like there is, we need to avail ourselves of social media and other platforms where we can actually be vocal. I feel like this Atlanta shooting is the first time in my memory, in my entire life, that actually a major Asian American social justice issue has really taken the captured the attention of the entire United States. Before this, any Asian American issue would only be relevant to the Asian American community. Like no one else would care. No one noticed, and people would just let it happen. And this feels like this Atlanta shooting is the first time that I can remember that actually most non-Asians knew about it and cared about it. And I was like, wow, it's the year 2021. Why is it that it took so long for this to happen? But I feel like, you know, I know the question was directed as what can you do individually, but what you can do individually is to act corporately, right? It takes all, it's kind of like voting. People say, well, what does my vote count? Well, if everybody says that, then that changes the course of the election. But every drop in the bucket counts because you have a million drops, and that actually creates quite a tidal wave, right? So, and so another thing is enact on the individual level friendships and partnerships with other people in your neighborhood and community. So for example, as you guys are a Chinese church primarily, partner with African American churches in your neighborhood or Hispanic churches in your neighborhood. Do things with them. I remember when I was living in Boston, I went to Gordon Conwell Seminary, so I lived in Boston for 3 years when I was doing my MDiv out there, and I attended an Asian American church, but every Good Friday, and you know Good Friday's coming up this week, but every Good Friday, our church would get together with all the Black churches in the city of Cambridge, and we'd do a joint Good Friday service together. And I thought that was so cool, right? And it's like, doesn't mean you have to mix your congregation every Sunday, but at least like try to do it on a semi-regular basis. We did it on an annual basis. Every Good Friday, we would get together with the Black churches in Cambridge. So that was a really great partnership, and we worked together on things that we all cared about. Like, for example, the Black churches and our church teamed up with the Cambridge police in trying to stop drug trafficking in the neighborhood. You know, And so there's a lot of good that came out of that.
Thank you. Paul, we'll get to you next. I do want to ask, take one of the questions another question in the chat first. So could equity be considered reverse discrimination?
Yeah, I know this is why people say that, especially when it comes to the Asian American community, people distrust affirmative action, right? But let's put it this way. If somebody has had, if person A has had the advantage their entire life, like they always get the benefits, they always get the goodies, they always get everything. And then person B is given the advantage for one day. And then person A says, wait a minute, that's reverse discrimination because like, how come that person gets the goodies now? Well, that's because person A has gotten the goodies for their entire life. But this is what we often see. People who only care about equality and not equity, they're seeing the other side now get the goodies for once, and they're so mad about it. And I'm like, you do realize this is only like one day or 1 year compared to like the past, 50 years that you've had it, right? And yet they're like, but it's not fair, right? So sometimes if someone has been hogging the microphone the whole time, right, speaking for an hour, and then I'm switching the analogy here, and then you pass the microphone to someone else and they speak for 5 minutes, and the one who has had it for an hour is like, wait a minute, how come that person gets to speak? Because only one person can have the microphone at a time, right? Can't you let that other person speak for 5 minutes when you've had the microphone for a whole hour, right? And they're like, no, but it's not fair. How come they get to have? Well, people take turns, okay? So whose turn is it right now? You even look at the global church. The Holy Spirit has moved in different places throughout the church in history, right? At one point, the Middle East was the most Christian place. Another time in history, the Europeans were the most Christian place. Another time, it was the United States. And then now we're seeing Africa and Asia, China, Korea, Sub-Saharan Africa being the most Christian place. And, people take turns. And it's not reverse discrimination if people are taking turns, right? I think we need to, again, look at history and culture and context and say, well, if one group has had the mic for most of the time, why can't another group have the mic for part of the time? Yeah. But about, I know for affirmative action, and this is a whole other thing, there was that whole like Harvard discrimination case against Asian Americans, and I don't have time to unpack that now, but a lot of people say that Harvard was actually being Asians have actually disproportionately been negatively affected by affirmative action, whereas African Americans have been helped by affirmative action. So that's a whole other issue, which I don't have time to unpack right now. Yeah.
All right, thank you. One more question about equity and equality, then Paul, you please feel free to share. How does the concept of equity versus equality work when there are limited resources? For example, David Baki was rejected from UC Davis Medical School because he was white, and he sued and won for reverse discrimination.
Okay. Yes. This is something that universities have been struggling with a lot. Okay. So, for example, so I did my undergrad at Yale University. Okay. So I'm just going to give an example of this. Yale, in order to raise its profile as a world-class university, said we need to admit more international students, right? We can't just admit Americans, because there are a lot of bright people from other countries that we need to admit. But the more they admitted international students, which raised Yale's international global profile, the fewer Americans they could accept. And so what are you going to do, right? You only have so much dorm space. You only have so much classroom space. So is this reverse discrimination against Americans if you're admitting more international students? because there's limited resources. There's only X number of seats in the classroom, right, on campus. And so, yeah, in some sense, it is. It is. And so here's where individualism versus collectivism comes in. The individual will say, well, that's not fair that I get denied a spot as an American because Yale wants to admit more international students. But so that's an individual point of view. A collective point of view would be like, well, Americans have had spots at Yale for most of history. Why not give more internationals a spot at Yale now, right? Because they haven't had the chance as much as we have. So again, it's like the mic. It's again the story of the mic. One person has had the mic for an hour, and the other person has had the mic for 5 minutes, and the one who's had it for an hour is the one who has 5 minutes, saying, "How come I don't have the mic?" Well, because there's only one mic. There's limited resources. You can't both have the mic at the same time. So can you let that person have the mic for 5 minutes? And unfortunately, there is limited resources. So, and I think we just have to say, well, historically, who has been the person who has had fewer of the resources? Maybe it's their turn now, right, to have more of the resources. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so Paul is graciously having Patterson go next. So Patterson, Pastor Alex, you can unmic him, and Patterson, please ask your question.
You guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Hi, Dr. Yi, right? So my question is this. I just wanted to get your take on, or maybe where you would draw the line from personal responsibility, right? Because I think you spoke quite a bit about the fact that all these historical disadvantages and things that has happened to the Black community. And I'm hearing you say we must understand, right? We have to, and I want you to tell me where this personal responsibility comes, right? When we see these videos of people attacking, and there are, like, let's not talk about race, right? These people attacking defenseless Asian elderly people. Do we read into the context because they had such a tough life, they can go do a flying drop kick on some old person, and we must understand that because they're oppressed, that where do we draw the line here?
Yeah, great question. No, we do not give them a free pass. In fact, the guy who did the flying drop kick on the elderly Asian gentleman, I think, was Black, right? So I don't think anyone gave him a free pass on that. Everyone said that was an awful thing that he did, right? So no free pass, right? You strike down an elderly person, that's bad, no matter what race you are, right? Yeah. If a Black person shoots up a store, they're going to go to jail just like a white person would, right? So there's no free pass. You don't get a get out of jail card free if you're Black. But I think the issue is more that Blacks often go to jail even if they didn't commit a crime, right? So it's not, I don't think they ever get a free pass, but they get extra discriminated against. So, I think we always need to look at who is the oppressor and the oppressed. Oppressors can be oppressed and vice versa. You know, Jews were the victims during World War II because of the Holocaust. Then they got the state of Israel, and now they're the oppressor as they are launching missiles into Palestinian villages. Well, okay, so you know you see both sides here. Asian Americans can be oppressed because of the discrimination against us, but boy, we can be the oppressor too. I've heard lots of Asian Americans just say terrible derogatory things against Black people all the time. So it's like, I think we need to know that the dividing line of good and evil is actually through our own personal hearts. I think too often the media paints the picture as one race is good and one race is bad. That's not Christianity. Christianity is that dividing line of good and evil goes through the human heart. Martin Luther said in Latin, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, said in Latin, we are simul justus et peccator, which means we are simultaneously righteous and sinners. I mean, the Apostle Paul said this too, right? Like, I'm both a saint and a sinner at the same time. And so I think too often we don't understand that. And so if a person does bad, they do bad no matter what their race. Yeah. But I think the issue is too many people are being accused falsely because of their race. And that's where we really need to get at the heart of it.
Right, thank you. Can we, Paul, please feel free to ask your question. Pastor Alex, if you can unmic him.
Hey, Dr. Allen. I want to touch on a few points very quickly. Maybe if you can touch on these few things, that would be great. Again, I'm still trying to learn, what has been happening and, what caused what. And I think it's still a lot of things debatable. First, you touch on the redlining thing. I don't have a lot of knowledge about the redlining. The redlining I know about, it's from, I have some financial service background. So what redlining I learned about, it's, before 1970s, before the CRA law enacted, there are certain areas the banks or financial institutions did not lend money to. We call it redlining. But since 1970s, when the CRA, the Community Reinvestment law enacted, we are not allowed, as for the lenders or the financial institutions cannot make loans against those communities. So when you say we still have redlining, this is discriminating. As far as I know, I don't think this country allow any things or laws that are discriminating. So I still don't understand what redlining you're talking about. That's my first point. The second thing is you touch on the affirmative action, and thank you on that. So I have my own opinion about two things that I think have the biggest impact to the African American or the people of color. One is the affirmative action. The other is the minimum wage. They kind of came about to this country, maybe 40 or 50 years ago. So when you mention about affirmative actions, you use the example about the schooling system. And then you touch on our previous question from Peterson, so free pass. So when you say affirmative actions, it's I'm not sure it's the right term to say it's better or good for the people of color. Don't you think affirmative action is another free pass to them? I believe in it, and all the affirmative action is actually against something I truly believe in. Another system, I call it meritocracy, based on the merit system in the schooling. Don't we think the schooling should be based on merit? We should not base on like age, color, race, and all that, but just pure on merit. To me, it's kind of the most objective system we can have. And we have any other things that will create another discrimination, or people call it reverse discrimination. So I would like you to touch on the affirmative action a little bit more when it comes to the schooling. My third point is I want to see what you think about the minimum wage. Is minimum wage really helping the people of color or not? So thank you, Dr. Allen.
Great, thank you. Hold on, I'm closing the door here because my wife is putting their baby down for a nap, and I want to make sure that it's not disturbing him. I get very passionate when I talk about this subject, so sometimes my voice goes up a little bit. Okay, let's see. Let me touch on your second point first. This I think is the most salient. People come to America because they think they want the American dream. And the way they think the American dream works is like this. It's like a race. And those who get to the finish line first are the, sorry, now my cat is meowing at the door. have a baby and a cat, and they're both needing attention. Okay. The way that affirmative action, the American dream works is that you think there's like a race, there's a finish line. Those who run faster or harder, whether based on skill or hard work, get to the finish line and you reap the rewards, right? So that's capitalism is essentially a competition. And those who are smarter or work harder or have more skill are the ones who get to the finish line and reap the rewards, right? And we think, okay, so everyone's willing to run this race because you think it's a fair race. Actually, it's not a fair race. The way the race works is, okay, so everyone's at the starting line, you think, but actually some people are at the starting line. Some people are a mile ahead of the starting line. Other people are a mile behind the starting line. Some people are at the starting line, but they have broken legs. Other people are at the starting line, but they have a car that they can drive in. Other people are at this starting line, but they have to crawl, right? And then the gun goes off and says, okay, let's see who can win the race, right? Well, part of it is skill, part of it is hard work, but part of it is where society has started you off, right? Everyone, when they're born, they're dealt a certain situation in life. And I was born into upper middle class family where basically I had everything I ever wanted. I mean, like my mom was able to send me to SAT prep. I had private tutors. I had violin lessons. I had, private tennis lessons. I had, I went to a really good high school, and because my parents could afford to live in a really nice neighborhood, public high school, and I got into Yale. Okay, consider someone else who grew up in a poor neighborhood in the worst school district with divorced parents who have nobody mentoring them, nobody tutoring them, nobody helping them, and all their friends are on crack and are running around doing bad stuff. Now, compare their situation to my situation. Is that really fair to just say, well, it's a meritocracy, right? Or is it like, Ellen, you had all these advantages ahead of that other person, right? So let's say I get a 4.0 GPA and that other person gets a 3.8. Maybe we should say that 3.8 is as good as Alan's 4.0, considering that that person had friends who are on crack, had broken home, grew up in a poor neighborhood, worst school district, and had divorced parents, right? Maybe that 3.8 is actually better than Alan's 4.0, right? Because, I mean, essentially, I started the race a mile ahead of the finish line or the starting line. Some people start a mile behind, so I have a 2-mile head start on them, right? So shouldn't we take that into consideration? It's not simply just hard work, right? Meritocracy, right? It's like, where do you start in this race? The American dream is not fair. It really is not fair. There's winners and there's losers. And honestly, I don't even think capitalism is in the Bible. I don't see it. I mean, I will not argue that communism is in the Bible either, so don't worry about that. But when I look at Acts chapter 2, it sure as heck looks more like communism than capitalism, right? Where everyone shares everything they have in common and help the least of these. It just feels, that doesn't look like capitalism to me. I think the American dream has been mapped onto Christianity, and we conflate the two. The two are actually not the same. And I don't think Jesus would recognize the system that we have today. Let's see. Minimum wage was your third question. Not sure what to say about that. I do think that there is something fair about having a living wage. I think minimum wage is the best of compromise between capitalism and communism. Capitalism would say, pure capitalism would just say, well, if you're cleaning toilets for a living, then you should get paid 50 cents an hour. Communism would say, it doesn't matter if you're cleaning toilets or if you're a heart surgeon, you should all get paid the same. Minimum wage says something in the middle. It says, well, yes, cleaning toilets is not the same as being a heart surgeon, but people need dignity. They can't live on 50 cents an hour. They're going to die. So at least give them something, which they can sort of live on, right? They can actually put some food on the table, right? Even if it's more than they deserve. Well, guess what? Christianity is about us all getting more than we deserve, right? Look at the parable of the workers in the field, where some people came at right in the morning, other people came in the mid afternoon, other people came at late at night. Some people worked all day, some people worked 1 hour, and then Jesus gave them the same wage, right? And some people are like, wait a minute, I worked all day. What about those people who, came in the last hour? And Jesus said, don't call unfair what I call fair. That's the opposite of capitalism, right? That's the relativism of the kingdom. I mean, if we cared about meritocracy in our faith, then we'd all go to hell, right? Our whole faith is based on grace, extending like things to people that they don't even deserve. That's what our whole religion is based on. And Jesus said in the parable of the unmerciful servant, if I forgive you all your debts and you don't forgive that to your fellow servant, you obviously don't get what I just did for you, right? So he threw that first servant in jail, which is an analogy for hell, because he didn't understand the grace that was shown him, and he didn't pass on that grace to others. See, the first greatest commandment, God loves us, and then that links to the second greatest commandment, we love neighbor. And if we don't love our neighbor, God says, you obviously don't understand the love that I've just shown you, right? And so I'm forgetting your first question. I don't know if you can repeat it briefly again.
Oh, you talk about the redlining.
Oh,
You
right.
said the
Yes.
redlining is still existing, and you said
Right.
the redlining law is discriminating. And as far as I'm concerned, low laws can be discriminating. And
Sure.
the redlining, I know it's not the same thing you talk about. So as I said, I came from the financial service industry. We had the redlining issue back in 1970s, but there's a CRA law enacted that was reversed that already. So I'm not sure what redlining you're talking about.
Yeah. First of all, I don't think that we have a perfect system yet. I think there are still a lot of laws that are discriminatory, and we have not overturned them because there's so many laws in America that are still on the books, even from like 100, 150 years ago, that make no sense. I mean, if you look this up, I remember seeing a law about something like in Nebraska, if your wagon is encircled by Native Americans and they start to circle your wagon, you're allowed to shoot them dead or something like that. And that's still on the law in Nebraska. Why is that? Well, no one bothered to overturn that. I don't know why it's just been there forever, right? There's a lot of laws in America who are like that. So instead of saying, well, we have no discriminatory laws anymore, sure we do. We have lots of discriminatory laws, just because we have 300 years of this American experiment, which there's a lot built into our system which is not fair. Now the more obvious ones we've tried to overturn, and hopefully we've overturned, but there's still a lot that's very unfair, and the system does work against certain people groups. So we have not gotten to a utopian society yet by any means. So regarding redlining, I guess all I mean is that zoning laws, things have been zoned either for economic purposes or for housing purposes or for voting purposes. And some of those zones are still in place. District lines are set in place, and they were maybe set 100 years ago, but they're still there, and they haven't been changed. So because people just haven't thought about it or haven't, yeah. So, and I think we need to recognize that some of those laws are still not fair, and some of them need to be overturned. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. I have another question, different topic. How are we to understand hate crimes to be racially motivated, where the perpetrators, like the recent Atlanta shootings, where the perpetrators are not explicitly declaring racial motivations?
Yeah. So I know that when this guy shot up these Asian massage parlors, the sheriff in Atlanta said this is not a racial motivation. Consider this. The guy went in, shot up one Asian massage parlor, drove 30 miles to another Asian massage parlor and shot that one up. 30 miles. How many different races did he pass between those two massage parlors? You know, thousands, if not millions of people. He didn't shoot them up. He specifically targeted Asian massage parlors, which were 30 miles apart. And the guy even admitted to a sex addiction. And again, the sheriff was like, well, he was just having a bad day, or he just had a sex addiction. The guy had an Asian female fetishization, is what he had. He sexualized Asian females and was obsessed over them, and was, he was the son of a pastor, a Southern Baptist pastor, right? And so the guy, the shooter, was feeling guilty about his that he was obsessed with Asian women, so that he went and tried to, he took Jesus's words out of context. And Jesus is like, well, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Well, the guy is like, well, if Asian women are causing me to sin, I'm going to shoot them up. That's essentially what he did. He took it out on Asian women because he himself had a sexual fetishization of them. And so to say that it wasn't racially motivated, it totally was racially motivated. It wasn't just race, it was also gender. It wasn't Asian males he was shooting up, it was Asian females. So, and the guy had his own psychological issues, and he took it out on Asian females. And, I've talked to a lot of my Asian female friends, and they're like, boy, I feel so like even more unsafe in America after that, right? Like that is, as an Asian male, I felt discrimination, but not as much as if I were an Asian female. I feel like this was targeting a double demographic. It's females and Asians. So yeah, it definitely was. When you look at the data, look at what happened, the situation, it was definitely targeted. Yeah.
All right, we have time. We're concluding in about 7 minutes. I have one more question here, so probably can take one more after this one. Shouldn't we distinguish between government-imposed fairness and voluntary grace extended by people of faith?
Totally. This is a great one. This is the difference. Sorry, one of the main differences between Republicans and Democrats. Okay. And let me just be very clear about, I'm going to put my cards on the table. I'm neither Republican nor Democrat. Okay. The last few elections, I've actually voted third party because I think that both parties have some serious issues. I actually grew up voting Republican, but the more I learn about the Republican Party, or maybe not the more I learn, the more the Republican Party has morphed, the more disenchanted I become with it. Okay. But I can't bring myself to go Democrat. There's also some serious issues that I have problems with. So, and my pastor actually preached a sermon this couple Sundays ago, and he said that, what do you vote if you're like, pro-racial justice, you would go Democrat. If you're pro-life, you go Republican. If you are pro-gun control, then you would go Democrat. But if you're pro-traditional marriage, you'd go Republican. And he's like, which one would Jesus go for, right? It's like neither. He kind of wrote right down the middle. And so I think, anyway, I don't subscribe to either political party. But my point here is that one of the things that Republicans and Democrats fight about is individual versus corporate responsibility, right? So Republicans will say, well, it's the individual. The individual should be the one, like, don't tax the individual, right? Let them, out of their own free will, give to the poor. And then the Democrats would say, no, tax them, right? Steal from the rich, give to the poor. It's Robin Hood, right? That's what the Democrats do. So which one is right? Well, here's the problem. They're both right and they're both wrong. Let me explain what I mean by this. The reason why both of them fail is because of human sin. The Republicans will say, if you just do what the Democrats do, and you just tax the rich, and you give to the poor, you know what's going to happen? Those poor will become lazy because they're just going to get government handouts all the time. I think there's some truth to that. But you know what? There's also a lot of poor who really need it. And if you just take the Republican side on this, those poor who really need it are going to suffer. What happened to Acts chapter 2, where everyone, gives to those in need, and there's a collective sense of shared responsibility, right? On the other hand, Democrats will say, well, those Republicans, if you don't tax them and just tell them individually to give to the poor, human sin, they won't give to the poor. They're just going to hoard their own money. Well, there's some truth to that too. There's a lot of rich people who don't give to the poor. Now, there's also a lot of rich people who do give to the poor, but there's a lot who don't, right? And so which was the truth? I think it's both. I think you need to motivate people to give individually, but there are some government services which actually have to be enacted in order for some people to benefit, because there are some things that are way bigger than individuals can do. I always tell Republicans, who's your biggest hero in your history? Abraham Lincoln, because he freed the slaves. Did he do that individually, or did he do that through government? He did that through big government. That's right. So this big thing that you love Abraham Lincoln for doing, freeing the slaves, was not through personal individual responsibility. That was through big government. So some things can only be done through big government, and other things are better done through personal responsibility. I think it's a both and. The problem with politics today, because is that people only see half the story. They only see the good of their party and only see the bad of the other side. Right? Democrats will only see the good of theirs. They'll be like, oh, we're about pro-racial justice, and then they'll only see the bad about the Republicans. Republicans will only see the good about their side. Oh, we're pro-life, and they only see the bad of Democrats. And I'm like, actually, you know what? I think part of the American experiment is the balance of powers. If we can have both, it's actually a good thing. So here's the problem. We only have two political parties. And that's an issue, because there's only two choices, and we get extremism because of that. But the way to mitigate that is actually to have balance of powers. If the president is Republican, I want the Senate and the Congress to be Democrat. And if the president is Democrat, I want the Senate and the Congress to be Republican, because that's how we get a balance of power. And this tension of back and forth, or if the president switches, it's Republican and it's Democrat, and it goes back and forth, that's actually a good thing. So I think two-party system leads to extremism, but we need the balance of powers to properly. But honestly, the kingdom of God is above both. And so I don't think we should map our politics onto it. I think we should say both are Republican and Democrats have some things that cohere with Christianity and some things that don't. But ultimately, Jesus is above both. And you can vote whichever way you want, but just know that ultimately your political party is not the same as your Christianity.
Okay, we've got 1 minute. I do want to ask this question. So if you need to leave at 2:15, we understand that. And we've had 4 different speakers come on this topic, and none of them are identical positions, but they all love the Lord. And we need to understand that brothers and sisters have different, perspectives on this very complex matter. I hope that as we brought these different speakers come at Q&A, it will open our hearts to consider beyond what we perhaps have framed an issue or question, and research it more ourselves. But last question here, Dr. Ye, is with the terms oppressor and oppressed being used, there are some who say that this is critical race theory. What are your thoughts on this?
right? This is a huge thing. First of all, let me just say I don't like reductionism. I think what people will do is they'll say, "Oh, you voted for Trump, you're a Nazi. Oh, you voted for Biden, you're a Marxist," right? And then they'll just like do these one-word reductionistic thing. And people do this with CRT too. They're like, "Oh, you believe in racial equality. That's critical race theory, right?" Um, I don't believe that everything is about power versus powerless or oppressor versus oppressed. Okay. Um, maybe CRT people would say that. Okay. They would say everything can be reduced to oppressor or oppressed. Um, I don't think that everything can be reduced to that. However, I do think that oppressor and oppressed do exist in society. And it feels like there's only two, because we only have two political parties, there's only two responses to this. Either people say everything is oppressor or oppressed, or people say nobody is oppressor or oppressed. I'm like, actually, the truth is halfway in between, right? That's where I stand. I'm like, no, of course not. Not everyone is trying to. It's not always about oppression, but there's a heck of a lot that is. And here's the thing: a lot of it is because of money. Okay, it's not because of hate; it's because of money. But worship of money leads to hate, or worship of money leads to, let me put it this way, bad effects on other people. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, right? And it's about how social media is so terrible. And it's not that Facebook and Twitter and Google are like these evil corporations, but it's because they are chasing money. And that's why it's having this terrible effect on people. Okay. And I think that a lot of the injustices in our society and oppression in our society, it's not because people are like, I hate Black people. It's because people are chasing money. And when they're chasing money, then they step on others to get the money, right? So, and people are like, well, if I haven't owned slaves, and if I never said the N word, then there's no racism in me whatsoever. And I'm like, okay, well, there's the middle option. Either you're completely innocent or you're completely a slave owner. No, there's a middle option, which is that you're chasing the money, and in chasing the money, you step on other people to get to the top, and that's where the injustices occur. And I don't think most people are going around hating others, but I do think that the consequences of their actions is that some people really get hurt in the process. They get trampled on the way to the finish line. Yeah. And I think we need to stop as Christians and look around and say, who is being trampled by my actions? Maybe I should slow down and not just worry about myself getting to the finish line. Maybe I should lift up someone else, because maybe me getting to the finish line is not the end goal. Maybe Jesus wants me to lift up others and help them across the finish line.
All right. Thank you so much. Our time is up. Thank you for everybody for participating today. And I think it was a good discussion we had today and sharing. Thank you again, Dr. Ye, for being with us. And would you bless us by praying for us in closing the session?
You got it. Jesus, we need you. We need you. This is Palm Sunday, and we journey with you into Jerusalem, the humble suffering servant riding in on a donkey who endured a week of passion on the way to the cross. But just as we suffer with you, we are also raised with you. And so I pray that you help us to see things with your perspective. Compassion means to suffer with, but not only us, but also having eyes to see those who are also suffering, and to love as you loved, and to care as you care for others, and to really enact the second greatest commandment, which is to love neighbor. And the late neighbor you defined to the Jew as the Samaritan, who was the racially different person who was hated. So help us to do that. Help us to do the second greatest commandment, which is to love the Samaritan, to love the racially different person who is most hated, to and I pray as we do that, that we might understand more of your gospel, that we would know that as we love the marginalized, this is exactly the same kind of love that you showed to us who were sinners and children of wrath and sons doomed to destruction, um, and yet you raised us up and you loved us, even though we were completely undeserving of it. And so I pray that we would extend that to others, and grace upon grace and love upon love, to show the world that you are the God of love. So as we march towards Easter, may that ever be present on our minds and our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Good to be with you.